Mighty Number 9, what the hell went wrong?
If you have any idea, let us know in the comments because we don't know. Okay, thanks for watching. See you next time. $4 million, 3 years, pain development and delays, launch disaster. It seems that anything that could have gone wrong with Mighty Number 9 did go wrong. From the earliest days of development until the final days leading up to its release, and even after. So where did the $4 million given by Kickstarter backers even go? Development of this game was split between Concept, Keiji Inafune's company, and Inti Creates, an 80-person company already well established in the industry. Inti Creates has an extensive resume with well-received titles such as Mega Man ZX, Mega Man Zero, and Azure Striker Gunvolt. And even if its intentions are good, Mighty Number 9 tries to both adhere rigidly to the classic Mega Man formula and draw focus to its own new mechanics, and the result is... okay. Here's the problem. Mighty Number 9 is a game playing an unwinnable and unending tug-of-war with itself, mechanics fighting against each other from start to finish. It's a great study of how classic run-and-shoot gameplay can be continuously marred, blurred, and skewed into a questionable final product. Though, given the huge amount of Kickstarter hype, the association with Keiji Inafune, and the promise of bringing Mega Man gameplay into the current decade, Mighty Number 9 has, in all likelihood, been held under greater scrutiny than it might otherwise have. To try to make some sense of what went wrong, let's examine level design, boss abilities, controls and interface, game flow, and pacing. This is part 1, where we'll take a broad look at just some of the game's mechanics. We'll mostly focus on basic controls and dashing, and how these are tied to level design in the opening minutes of the game. Future installments will go into much more detail regarding level design, boss weapons, visuals, and a lot more. But we'll try to keep these videos fairly bite-sized and compartmentalized, just so it's easier to watch. In this video and other installments of this series, we're going to make extensive use of the concept of flow, shown here. Flow theory says that any challenge in a game should try to be kept proportional to player ability over time, or else the player is likely to be bored if the challenge is too low, or frustrated and angry if the challenge is way too high. We have an entire long-form analysis devoted to exploring the relationship between difficulty level and player flow in video games. You know, I hate to say it, but there's no easy way to analyze Mighty Number 9 without drawing direct comparison to Mega Man, both the classic and X series, but I think this is fair enough for a few reasons. As a self-proclaimed spiritual successor and a modern take on the Mega Man formula by a very well-known industry name, Mighty Number 9 has been presented from the start as borrowing the same basic framework and design principles of Mega Man. And really, it won't make a lot of sense to look at the game in a vacuum anyway, when we know about the very clear standards it attempts to match and even exceed. Mega Man has been iterating on these standards for the better part of about 25 years, and all the successes and pitfalls of each iteration have been laid bare for game designers and players alike to witness, with the knowledge of decades of game design behind us. And we would expect the developers to do the same. As a quick example, pretend that you're designing a stage for a new Mega Man game, and you have a drop point at the end of a hallway. You can choose to place solid ground on the next screen so that Mega Man will land safely, or you could place instant death spikes so that the player is surprised and killed upon landing. I'll give you 2 minutes or so to think about which situation is better, except I won't because you already know which one is better. Yet, some of my clearest and most frustrating memories of Mighty Number 9 involve such blind jumps leading to deaths. Despite that, more often than not within this particular genre, a blind downward jump typically acts as a transition between screens, not a death pit.
And you do get infinite air dash. You can just keep air dashing in the air. It feels like doesn't really feel like Mischief Makers, but it's just
cool. Wait,
Thanks.
that's just a blind drop?
Yep.
No.
Yeah.
Presented with the same scenario in a side-scrolling Mario game, you'd be pretty certain that it's a bottomless pit, and you wouldn't jump in. So even though Mario and Mega Man are both 2D side-scrolling platformers, they both have their own respective sub-genre rules about how we should approach blind jumps. And we should logically expect Mighty Number 9 to follow those rules unless it intends to iterate on them in a meaningful way. If we want to see this interaction on the good old flow meter, we would expect something like this. Wah, wah. So one way to look at Mighty Number 9 is to count its iterations and regressions of its genre, meaning does it iterate in meaningful and appropriate ways, and if not, are such iterations actually a step back or regression in what we know to be good game design? The blind jumps example we just talked about is probably a regression in my opinion, and I don't think many would disagree. Regression can take almost any form and affect any mechanic in a game. Take the very first stage of Mighty Number 9, which is the highway, eerily reminiscent of Mega Man X's very first stage. The highway in Mega Man X is highly successful at introducing new concepts to the series. Egoraptor has already done incredible work breaking down the stage and showing how it teaches the player everything they need to know in the first seconds of gameplay. In short, Mega Man X's Highway is tailored to teach the player about all the mechanics they'll need to succeed. Jumping, wall climbs, charge shots, the whole thing. There are safe hazards that require you to demonstrate basic proficiency with the controls in order to progress. We have platforms that disintegrate if you stand on them for too long. We have valleys with very smartly placed terrain that essentially guarantees the player will discover wall grabbing purely by accident when they attempt to escape an otherwise empty pit. And for the observant player, Zero will show you in a cutscene that holding down the fire button charges your buster. In contrast, Mighty No. 9 takes the beat you over the head approach by not only stopping the gameplay to crawl through dialogue, but also by explicitly displaying the controls as text prompts. Text-based, game-interrupting tutorials weren't present or even necessary in earlier Mega Man games. Put another way, those developers trust their game enough to let it speak for itself, and they trust you enough to understand what they're trying to tell you through gameplay alone.
Black, you're heading into a tunnel. It might affect visibility. Be careful.
So just like Mega Man X did, Mighty No. 9 introduces a few new twists to the Mega Man formula, but their overall implementation is pretty lackluster at best, and detrimental at worst. One quick example is the alternate fire mechanic. There's rarely, if ever, an optimal opportunity to use alternate fire in synergistically constructed level designs. And the best way to learn about alt fire isn't by playing, it's actually by reading about it in the tips menu. Alt fire really just feels like it doesn't have a place in the game. And this is a recurring theme, and arguably the biggest problem with Mighty No. 9. It's as if mechanics and level design were created by two entirely separate teams. There's almost no synergy between the two, and thus no chance for them to come together to create a cohesive experience. And this kind of obfuscation keeps happening. Throughout the game, you're presented with situations that are less about encouraging discovery through learning or smart level design, and more about just consulting the massive tips menu to understand what you're doing wrong. It's jarring enough that to fully understand how dashing works or how a boss weapon operates, you need to pause the game and dig through the menu until you find a few lines of text that explain it to you. This is a massive detriment to player flow. It takes the player out of the game, both figuratively and literally, and it introduces a superfluous and verbose menu of mechanical tutorials, many of which would be much more easily understood by just showing the player through gameplay. For the best possible flow, you'd want to integrate all of these tips into the game, heck, even into the first level, by showing them in action. Mega Man X did just this way back in 1993. And to be fair, Mighty is a bit more complex mechanically, but that just makes it all the more apparent that Mighty's intro stage needed to teach you everything, but fails to really teach you much of anything. This intro stage was the perfect opportunity to recalibrate our expectations of the Mega Man formula, but it ends up being less successful than a game that came out 25 years ago. Arguably, the game's major mechanic is dashing into enemies. In the first stage, you'll learn to dash into weakened enemies to kill them and gain points. Once again because you're guided by on-screen tutorial prompts. Remember that time that you learned math by watching someone else do it while you never had to lift a finger? Probably not, because humans usually learn through experience rather than passive observation. That learning is what makes us feel good when we solve a puzzle or get past a tricky section of a level. And if the answer is just given to us, then we're probably not internalizing or having as much fun as we could be. Instead of telling us how to absorb enemies by dashing into them, why not let us discover it ourselves? Easy fix. Place a gap that's too large to simply jump across, and have an already weakened enemy waiting on the other side. No matter how many times you fail the jump, you know that there's a way to get there, and 10 seconds of experimentation with your controller will teach you that there is a way to dash, and then your brain will tell you to string a jump into a dash, and then you will observe with your eyeballs that enemies who are in this blue cubey weakened state are destroyed when you dash into them. At the same time, you've taught yourself that large gaps can still be crossed when a standard jump won't do, and that you can chain jumps into dashes. You can probably already think of some unusual or interesting level designs that iterate on this very simple dashing idea. In fact, this example is already partially implemented into the intro stage. But with a fairly important difference. The enemy at the other end of the gap is not weakened. New or cautious players are likely to simply shoot the enemy till he's weakened, then because they're not in any danger, continue shooting until he's destroyed, and finally they'll just cross the gap like normal. And instead of killing 3 birds with 1 stone by teaching weakened enemies, dash jump chaining, and absorbing enemies, the game presents a situation that's too unfocused to effectively teach the player multiple concepts. This is what a broken tutorial looks like. It's possible for you to skip over these important concepts entirely by accident, and it's not your fault. If the player decides to just shoot the enemy until it's destroyed, then that player has learned an incomplete and misleading set of rules. In fact, just before this gap section, there's another Force tutorial that has you dash into a weakened enemy, but you're not told why, and there isn't any clear visual feedback. In fact, the dialogue highlights this word, assimilation, to describe dashing into weakened enemies. But unless you read about it in the tips menu, you might not really know why assimilation is even useful. So we've just learned this rule that you should dash into weakened enemies, but the game has failed to provide any real incentive for us to do so. 10% of what? Do I want a low number or a high number? This tutorial is roughly 10 seconds long, but it's incomplete. If this is your first time playing this level, you might pass through this section a little confused. And then you'll come to the gap example we just talked about, which in the end might not tell you a whole lot that you don't already know just by fiddling around with controls. Both of these examples are fully controlled environments, so the dashing mechanic appears to be smoothly integrated into the gameplay. But in practice, using the dash mechanic to destroy enemies usually comes off clunky, and sometimes it makes me rage. For one thing, enemies like to gather in clusters, and unless you're already powered up from Assimilation, the standard buster doesn't pierce through enemies. So your options are either to weaken and then dash into each enemy sequentially, which is tedious and boring, or you could tank through the entire section because it's not worth your time. But a first-time player can't possibly know this, and is likely to just dash on through to see what happens. If you dash through the first enemy, you'll collide with the second one, and you'll take some damage while receiving knockback. Of course, repeat this situation over a pit or a set of spikes, and we're nearing NES difficulty. Castlevania, Ninja Gaiden, Mega Man, and countless others employed knockback over bottomless pits to cause instant death for the inexperienced player. Early Mega Man games capitalized on this by placing enemies on or near platforms in such a way that if you're trying to tank through the stage without fighting, you're going to be punished and you're probably going to die. The main idea is, of course, to stand at range and shoot, which luckily is exactly the behavior that this kind of level design is meant to encourage. But with Mighty No. 9, you're trying to remain close to enemies to combo your dash and power up, because the game has told you that you need to dash into enemies. So you might spend more time near dangerous bottomless pits where a stray bullet from a secondary enemy could knock you right in. I consider chain dashing to be an interesting concept with broken execution. Enemy placements and level designs don't synergize at all with the ability to continuously dash between enemies to rack up points, and the constant threat of you'll lose points if you don't dash into enemies quickly enough makes for a lot of frustration when you're trying to play defensively at a distance. If you try to use dashing to its fullest, you'll likely end up taking a lot of avoidable damage from enemies and bosses. And right now, you might be thinking, nah, he's probably exaggerating. Well, I replayed this first level 5 minutes ago, and even knowing the rules of the game, I was still caught off guard at how poorly the enemies are placed and how difficult it is to have ranged combat. I was even surprised here at this next section where enemies appear from the left, the right, and even the foreground, which led to this. To fix dashing in Mighty No. 9, you would either have to redo the level design or redo the dash system, and I think adjusting the dash system could have been a fairly straightforward fix. Maybe have nearby enemies weaken whenever you successfully dash through an already weakened one, and signify this with a small visual area effect. The AoE range can still be small enough that it works when enemies are lined up in a row, while not trivializing enemies in sequential parts of the level. You could even have the dash cycle refresh on each enemy so that Beck automatically dashes through several enemies without requiring the player to spam the dash button. Maybe you could have Beck rebound off a weakened enemy so that he's closer to his initial position, and you now have enough distance from other enemies to avoid damage. Or we could try forcibly setting Beck's movement speed to 0 upon a successful assimilation, stopping all forward momentum and therefore risk of unintended collisions. I mean, those last two aren't even good examples. They're pretty bad, in fact, but even they would still be an improvement over what Mighty No. 9 already has. Our goal with this video was to take a bird's eye view of some of the most bass-ackwards mechanics in Mighty No. 9. Dashing, weakened enemies, dashing into weakened enemies, platforming, ranged level design, and a Mega Man game based on close quarters combat. All of these are constant and recurring themes throughout the entire game. I mean, we didn't even get to discuss this game's version of the E-Tank. Here's a hint, it's broken as Anyway, we just wanted to highlight the biggest problems in Mighty No. 9, but there is a second staple of the Mega Man formula that has so far been conspicuously absent. With that in mind, the next installment in this series will address boss weapons and boss weaknesses. Here's a hint, they're broken as few. You have any thoughts on Mighty No. 9? Feel free to share them with us and others in the comments. We actually don't personally know anyone else who's played the game, and we'd love to hear what your experience with the game has been. I also wanted to mention that we now have a Patreon page. It's patreon.com/gamesoup. We want to give huge special thanks to C-Bomber and Elmo97 as our first 2 patrons. It just means so much to us, to Joe and me, that people are willing to support the channel, and I found that to be really inspiring, so thank you so much. So until next time, we want to thank everyone for watching Game Soup.